Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, and I do want to head to some international news that we have been following here. The Israeli military now saying that it's destroyed 70 to 80% of the strategic military capabilities of ousted Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his regime. This comes after a 48-hour bombing campaign dubbed Bashan Arrow that the Israel Defense Forces says was aimed at preventing these, quote, very advanced weapons from falling into the hands of the wrong people. The IDF and the Israeli Air Force saying they carried out more than 300 strikes against those targets in Syria. Want to bring in a friend of the show here to talk a little bit more about the situation developing there. So let's bring in Mark Chandler, Director of Government Relations and Professor of Practice at Coastal Carolina University, also a former senior defense intelligence official. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us.
You're welcome, and good evening, Josh.
Good evening. Well, first off, I want to talk about how significant this is for Israel, because we're talking 70 to 80% of those weapons and just materials that were used there by Syria. So how significant is it, but also why is Israel working to destroy all of that?
Well, I think this is a very significant move by the Israeli, and it's a strategic military decision. When you look at what they're doing, they are methodically taking out a lot of the offensive capability that Syria had left behind. So if you will, a big focus is on the aircraft and the naval craft that can conduct those offensive operations, but a very strategic and very prudent move is taking out the chemical munitions. And that's what Israel started with the other day. You know, they're actually taking out targets that we, the U.S., had on a target list years ago. But the Obama administration made a last-minute decision not to take those out. And subsequent to us not taking out those targets, the Syrian regime, along with the Russians and the Iranians, used those against the Syrian people. So you can see that was a strategic mistake we made that Israel is not going to repeat. And so they don't want these to fall into the hands of any kind of government that's going to take over, whether it's an extremist government or something that may be more moderate. We just don't know. So I think this is a prudent move by Israel, and one that, since they have the military advantage right now, it's one that they're going to take. Remember, they created this operation, or this vacuum, if you will, with the defeat of Hezbollah and the Iranians inside Syria. So I think it's a next logical step, if you will.
And going a bit deeper into that, we know that the U.S. and the U.K. have said that they are all for this situation that is happening. But then you have Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt who are against this. So can you explain some of the background there on why you have some countries that are saying this is a good move, and then you have others who are saying not so much?
Well, first off, as I said, I think the U.S. is appreciative that Israel's kind of cleaning up the mess it left behind by not taking out some of those weapons of mass destruction when we had the chance about 10 years ago. So that's part of it. The second part, you know, the U.S.-UK has designated HTS a terrorist organization. I mean, when you look at the leader, Jalwani, he actually traces back to 2003, my time in Iraq, when he was fighting against us, and he was starting to follow the ISIS leadership and the al-Qaeda leadership at that time. So he has ties to both those terrorist organizations, regardless of the moderate approach it seems that he's, at least on a public face, putting out now. We still have a $5 or $10 million bounty on Jalwani's head for what he did against us, you know, back in 2003, 2005, and then fighting with ISIS and al-Qaeda. He actually headed al-Nusra Front when al-Qaeda was trying to stand up in this during the Civil War. So that's the U.S. and UK perspective. But what you're seeing with the Arab states, you know, you're seeing a combination of what they did to fight against the Syrian regime, but also some rapprochement that they've had in the last year to try to bring Assad back into the fold as an Arab state. Turkey, I can talk a long time about Turkey, but Turkey has its own initiative and own ideas of what it wants to see come out of this.
The fall of Assad, what impact is that likely to have, not just on Israel, but when you look at the Middle East as a whole, when you step back, what impact is likely there?
Well, this is something I wrote my students about this week. And what I told them is that, this is a seminal event in history that you see taking place in the Middle East. You could see a reshaping of the Middle East as we look at that. If I can put Syria in perspective for just a minute, when I go back at the start of the Civil War 13 years ago, and if you were to look at a map of Syria today and color code it by all the different rebel factions, and then cut that shapes out, what you would have is a jigsaw puzzle of significant proportions scattered across all of Syria. Now, wait 1 week, and guess what? Those colors change and the shapes change. And that is the nature of the cultural, the religion, the different sects that are all inside Syria today. Now, they're vying for support. You had one of the key leaders, the HTS group, that kind of has led this charge, but you still have a different faction in the South. You've got U.S. supported efforts out in the Far East. You've got Kurdish efforts that Turkey absolutely despises up in the north and in the far eastern part of Syria. And then, as I said, you had Arab states involved in complete fighting against Assad throughout there. And sometimes those Arab states would have their factions fight one another. So what's going to come out of this? I think if anyone says they're an expert, including myself, that we know what's going to come out, I think we're way too early to tell that. I think you have to look at this change being something that could be as significant as when Yugoslavia fell, and now you have all these different Balkan states there. You could see a fracturing of Syria into multiple states, or something that's kind of forced together again. So it's really a dangerous time, even though I know that the leadership, the transition, is talking about 6 to 18 months trying to bring some sort of rule to Syria. But Syria is kind of a hodgepodge of different cultures, tribes, and religions thrown in there. I think what Israel did, securing its borders, taking out some of the offensive weapons, is probably the prudent move, and then to kind of stay on the defensive. Remember, Syria's invaded Israel twice, unprovoked, in the 60s and the 70s.
And I want to go a little bit deeper. As you said, not everyone can look into the future and see what is going to happen. But a big question that we've seen posed a lot, and I just want to get your take on it overall. I'm sure your answer will probably pretty much be the same. It's a waiting game. But we've had so many people who have asked, what does the fall of Assad mean for the supreme leader of Iran? Is that a possibility there that it could be impacted?
Well, I'm not going to say wait and see, but let's wait and see. What I think we have to look at is there's a similarity between two regimes that are both authoritarian, and Assad fell apart because he just had that ruthless authoritarian nature to him. The difference here with Iran is you have the Persian culture in Iran, so it's a little bit more homogeneous structure and build up or make up inside Iran. But what I do think you're going to see is Iran is taking notice. Let me go back to the fact that Iran is actually weakened with the defeat or the beatdown that Hezbollah has taken. They've lost a staunch ally in Syria since 1979. Those two have been close allies. So you start to see that fracturing. The supreme leader is going to take notice. I think what you may see is a kind of turning inward a little bit to kind of recalibrate its strength. Obviously, the Israeli strikes back in October were a little bit more severe and meaningful, had a significant impact on the regime because we haven't seen a retaliation. So I think you're going to see a focus inward to kind of build up and then try to figure out how they can go forward without the Syrian ally to help Hezbollah build back up. So I don't think you're going to see a crumbling. Matter of fact, you might see some more crackdowns. If you see any kind of protest inside Iran, they'll come out a lot stronger on it. But I think they're going to move forward and focus on what they can do to protect themselves.
Let's head over to Gaza and talk a little bit more about the situation between Israel and Hamas overall. We've heard this time and time again, and you and I have discussed this, but there are some rumblings, so to speak, that we may be closer to a ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. Does that appear to be the case just based on the information that you've seen coming out over the past several hours and maybe days? Are we any closer now than we were months ago?
Well, I have to say, Josh, that I am more optimistic these days than I have been in past interviews. When I start to look at this, a lot of the Arab countries, Qatar, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, their press has released statements that Hamas is saying, they're open to more discussions. They're going to be more amenable to certain things and even discuss the release of some of the names of potential hostages to be released. So that to me is positive. Now, today there was a spokesman, a Hamas spokesman in Lebanon, who came out and said, no, that's not true. We're not going to do that. However, I think since Sinwar's death, since Israel killed Sinwar, you've seen more openness from Hamas to consider a negotiation. And I think that there probably is some truth to some of these leaks that are coming out from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. So I think we're moving forward positively. But with anything to do with these negotiations, it can slip up and fall apart, at any time. And I just want to say, getting those hostages out, the 100 that are left, but maybe 50 are alive, that's going to be critical to any kind of moving forward. But Hamas has even said, and this was a couple of weeks ago, they're open to leaving Israeli troops inside Gaza. So that to me is positive. I don't know, you've asked me before if it'll happen before the inauguration. That could be a pushing it, or we could have some openings in the next couple of weeks.
My last question, you're kind of an expert when it comes to the Houthis, and we haven't talked about them a lot. But recently we did hear from the U.S., maybe within 24 hours ago, that they had actually thwarted an attack, so to speak. So what do we know about that, and what are the Houthis kind of up to? Are they still as powerful as they maybe were months ago?
Well, to answer your last question first, I think they're starting to feel the pain of some Israeli and U.S. airstrikes that had taken place back in October and early November. But as you point out, they attacked 2 U.S. destroyers just this past weekend, that were escorting 3 commercial ships through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden. So they're still viable in that. 1 week ago, they did the same thing. Those same 2 destroyers were attacked while escorting 3 other commercial ships through the same area. So the Houthis still have a capability. They're always going to have that capability. I think putting Iran back on its heels, if you will, what Israel did, is kind of slowing down the resupply of the Houthis, but they're still there. So you're going to look at how this plays out. They're still going to try to attack. Matter of fact, they did try a UAV and a missile attack on southern Israel about the middle of last week. So they're doing what they can, but their supplies, they have reduced supplies. So as long as we can keep those down and stop Iran from resupplying them, they're going to kind of peter out a little bit. Not go away, but I think you're still going to see them kind of husband their assets, if you will, for these bold attacks like they did the last 2 weekends on Navy destroyers.
All right, Mark Chandler, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, regardless of what time of day it is. Thank you again. Anything you want to add before I let you go?
You're quite welcome, Josh. Yeah, I would just like to add something about a young man named Austin Tice. Austin is a former Marine officer, but then he got out of the Marine Corps and he became a journalist. And in doing so, he worked for a lot of the different news agencies. He was captured in August of 2012. First he was captured by some of the same rebels that are in there and the different factions, and the Syrian regime took control of him. I just don't want us to forget the side of that. While everything's happening, hopefully, we can get his release. There's strong indications he's still alive, but I just want to give that shout out for Austin and maybe try to get him freed at the same time out of Syria.
And I was going to point out, yeah, we heard from some folks here in the U.S., some high-up officials over the last several days, that there is evidence that he is alive. So hopefully he is released soon. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. We appreciate it.
Josh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course.